The summer of 1973 came down on Winona, Minnesota, like a burning fever. The type of heat that turned the Mississippi River into a sparkling mess of broken glass in the hot sun. It was a summer in which children played outside until the fireflies came out at night, in which screen doors creaked open 100 times a day, and in which a small town of 4,000 finally had its breath back after another hard, brutal winter. Then July 14th arrived, and everything was never the same again. That night, Main Street erupted into color for the River Days Festival. The streets rang with the cotton candy sweetness, the brilliant lights, and the whining of carnival rides. Laughter and music surrounded Michael and Daniel Carvalho, 16-year-old twins with dark hair and their mother's piercing green eyes. They'd pleaded with their parents to take them. Their father, Antonio, a welder with a hard face and gentle heart, wasn't certain. Their mother, Maria, holding her frayed rosary, wavered too. But after some coaxing, she broke into a smile and said yes. The boys were responsible kids, straight-A students, altar boys at St. Stanislaus Church. They'd worked for a night of liberty. At 6, the twins rode away on their shiny Schwinn bikes, the sun setting catching the chrome, as neighbors gazed after them as they sped down East 4th Street, whooping like they owned the world. It was the last time anyone would ever see them alive. There, they dissolved into the laughter and pandemonium, throwing rings at stands, huddling to share funnel cake, chatting with schoolmates near the tilt-a-whirl. Emma Renard, a quiet student from their geometry class, recalled Michael purchasing her lemonade as Daniel joked with him about it. All was secure, normal, to normal, but by 9:30, when the night sky had darkened to indigo, friends were bidding goodbye to the twins. They had to be home by 10. Their father did not accept lateness. 10 struck, then 11. By midnight, Maria was walking holes in the kitchen floor, rosary beads clicking wildly in her shaking hands. Antonio drove twice around the town in his pickup, headlights illuminating the deserted streets. By the time he entered the Winona County Sheriff's Office at 12:45 a.m., his hands were shaking. The duty deputy attempted to calm him down. Teens lose all sense of time all the time. But Antonio wasn't fooled. Something was amiss. Morning arrived like a bad joke. The rising sun colored the bluffs gold, and showed him a nightmare. A farmer, Carl Weber, who was driving down Highway 61 at 6:15 a.m., had seen the two bicycles in the tall grass off the shoulder. He recognized them from afar. Town folks always do. They were Michael and Daniel's bikes. He stopped, the gravel crunching beneath his boots, and walked cautiously toward them. The bicycles rested in serene peace on their sides, wheels still rotating slowly in the morning air. No skid marks, no struggle marks, only quiet. In about an hour, Highway 61 was bustling with flashing lights. Sheriff Donald Keller and his officers converted the roadside into a command center. Clicks of cameras, evidence markers waved in the heat. The bicycles were carefully placed into a county van like they were holy artifacts. Behind the yellow tape, Antonio and Maria stood there, stunned. Maria's rosary clicked with the rhythm of fear. Antonio's gaze was on the vacant spot of grass, as if he could will his sons back from the fog curling off the river. By noon, the search was underway. And in Winona, when tragedy struck, everybody came. Over 200 volunteers and neighbors, teachers, factory workers, churchgoers, converged on the sheriff's staging ground near Loch Island, where the Mississippi looped like a question mark through the forest. Father Joseph Quinn blessed the crowd, and groups spread out with maps and flashlights. Bloodhounds sniffed the pillowcases of the twins, barking frantically as they picked up the scent. The search continued for 2 hot, long weeks. Men and women pushed chest-deep through weeds under 90-degree sun. They combed abandoned mills, drainage tunnels, and riverbanks. Divers dove into the murky Mississippi, visibility only inches, hoping, and afraid, of what they might discover. Local radio broadcast news every hour. The Carvalho family was shown on the night news, stiffly seated on their living room sofa. Maria quietly explained in halting English about her boys, how Michael wished to be an engineer and Daniel hoped to be a doctor. Antonio uttered only 5 words, which would haunt the entire town for decades. "Please bring my boys home," but the boys never returned. Every find proved to be a false lead, a ripped blouse, the incorrect shoe, a mistaken identification of animal bones as human. By the end of July, the search parties became scarce. Individuals had work to attend to, families to support, and lives that, agonizingly, had to continue. Sheriff Keller stood in his office, looking at a map covered in colored pins, indicating each location that had been searched. He was burdened with the weight of failure upon his shoulders. Through his window, the Mississippi flowed by, ancient, silent, and unforgiving. Whatever its secrets might have been, it wasn't about to share them. 3 weeks gone, Keller occupied his small, smoke-filled office by himself, cigarette smoke drifting toward the ceiling. Open on his desk before him was the case file of the Carvalho twins, the same one he'd read 100 times, each page providing more questions than answers. To bicycles, a missing pair of brothers. The bicycles rested in serene peace on their sides, wheels still rotating slowly in the morning air. No skid marks, no struggle marks, only quiet. In about an hour, Highway 61 was bustling with flashing lights. Sheriff Donald Keller and his officers converted the roadside into a command center. Clicks of cameras, evidence markers waved in the heat. The bicycles were carefully placed into a county van like they were holy artifacts. Behind the yellow tape, Antonio and Maria stood there, stunned. Maria's rosary clicked with the rhythm of fear. Antonio's gaze was on the vacant spot of grass, as if he could will his sons back from the fog curling off the river. By noon, the search was underway. And in Winona, when tragedy struck, everybody came. Over 200 volunteers and neighbors, teachers, factory workers, churchgoers, converged on the sheriff's staging ground near Loch Island, where the Mississippi looped like a question mark through the forest. Father Joseph Quinn blessed the crowd, and groups spread out with maps and flashlights. Bloodhounds sniffed the pillowcases of the twins, barking frantically as they picked up the scent. The search continued for 2 hot, long weeks. Men and women pushed chest-deep through weeds under 90-degree sun. They combed abandoned mills, drainage tunnels, and riverbanks. Divers dove into the murky Mississippi, visibility only inches, hoping, and afraid, of what they might discover. Local radio broadcast news every hour. The Carvalho family was shown on the night news, stiffly seated on their living room sofa. Maria quietly explained in halting English about her boys, how Michael wished to be an engineer and Daniel hoped to be a doctor. Antonio uttered only 5 words, which would haunt the entire town for decades. "Please bring my boys home," but the boys never returned. Every find proved to be a false lead, a ripped blouse, the incorrect shoe, a mistaken identification of animal bones as human. By the end of July, the search parties became scarce. Individuals had work to attend to, families to support, and lives that, agonizingly, had to continue. Sheriff Keller stood in his office, looking at a map covered in colored pins, indicating each location that had been searched. He was burdened with the weight of failure upon his shoulders. Through his window, the Mississippi flowed by, ancient, silent, and unforgiving. Whatever its secrets might have been, it wasn't about to share them. 3 weeks gone, Keller occupied his small, smoke-filled office by himself, cigarette smoke drifting toward the ceiling. Open on his desk before him was the case file of the Carvalho twins, the same one he'd read 100 times, each page providing more questions than answers. To bicycles, a missing pair of brothers. It was 1973. Minnesota had no state database of sex offenders. No monitoring system for suspicious vehicles from county to county. No cameras, no forensics, No digital trail to pursue. Only a few fuzzier, witness descriptions of a pickup that could have had 10,000 owners in the state. Lombardi spent hours on the phone with surrounding sheriff's offices, inquiring about missing children, unexplained vanishings, known offenders. Each tip went nowhere. Nothing was linked, and yet, rumors around town began to circulate a name, one which never technically showed up in Keller's reports, but refused to disappear in gossip. Thomas Bianchi. He'd been teaching physical ed at Winona Senior High for more than 10 years. 42, unmarried, reserved, lived alone in a tiny rental home on West Broadway. His students characterized him as intense, sometimes too intense. There were stories about the way his eyes lingered during gym class, the words that crossed invisible lines most teachers intuitively knew not to cross. 3 days after the twins disappeared, the sheriff's office had an anonymous call. The caller wouldn't say her name, but instructed them to take a close look at Bianchi. She'd seen him speaking with Michael and Daniel by the school that spring, inviting them to ride home. They declined. Keller and Lombardi interviewed him on August 2nd. Bianchi opened the door in sweatpants and an undershirt, his eyes frantically darting back and forth between the two officers. The heat of the August day clung to all, but his perspiration was born of fear, not weather. And later that evening, he sat in the tiny interrogation room, the Winona County Sheriff's Office, fingers laced tightly together on the table, a sheen of sweat glinting in the dim light. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, ghosts of hundreds of interviews that had been conducted in the same room. Keller sat opposite him, pen at the ready. Lombardi rested against the wall, arms folded, his eyes piercing, inscrutable. Bianchi cleared his throat and made the first move. He claimed to have been home the evening of July 14th, watching the Twins game on television, then turning in around 11. But alone, no one could vouch for it. Keller said nothing, allowing the silence to linger. He had learned years ago that innocent people hasten to fill silences with facts. Guilty ones allow the silence to breathe. Bianchi filled it. He spoke of his work, the joy he got from working with children, the satisfaction of watching angry teenage boys become assured young men through athletics. He spoke of the Carvalho twins. Well, of course he knew them. Fine players, fine students. Possibly he'd given them a ride home on a rainy day or so. That was simply being a good neighbor, wasn't it? His voice rose at the end, more of a plea than a declaration. Neither Keller nor Lombardi answered. Lombardi pushed off the wall and walked around the table, boots thudding on linoleum. He questioned the rumors, the unease some students had expressed, the rumor that never officially became a complaint. Bianchi went redder. He asserted he never had done anything wrong, never had crossed any boundary. He was a teacher, a professional, and these suggestions were falsehoods. But Keller's instincts blazed. Innocent people spoke the truth. Guilty people defended themselves too much. When questioned about the truck, Bianchi shook his head. No, he didn't own one. Drove a blue Plymouth Duster, parked outside, if they wanted to look. Did he know anyone with a dark pickup? Perhaps half the men in Winona did, he said. The interview took 90 minutes. It yielded nothing concrete, no confession, no evidence, just tension. Bianchi had no alibi, but the lack of one wasn't proof of guilt. And the truth, whatever it was, remained as murky as the Mississippi itself. Thomas Bianchi's demeanor was a puzzle. Nervous, defensive, occasionally hostile. But then again, wasn't that how any innocent person might act, suddenly staring down police suspicion in a missing persons case? When he finally informed him he was free to leave, Bianchi sprang up so quickly his chair tipped backward, crashing across the linoleum. He didn't bother to go back and retrieve it. His hands were trembling. He pushed open the station door and plunged into the blinding afternoon sunlight. Lombardi watched him walk away, jaw clenched in frustration. They had nothing, no evidence, no confession, just a rumor of suspicion, and a mysterious phone call that could have been a grudge, or could have been the only truth they were ever going to get. But in 1973, emotions weren't sufficient for warrants and arrests, and in a town the size of Winona, emotions were sufficient to light a wildfire of rumor. In days, parents were phoning the school board, insisting Bianchi be suspended. People stopped talking when he entered stores. Former pupils stepped forward with uncomfortable tales, nothing illegal, but not quite right either. Remarks about boys' bodies, hands that seemed to linger a little too long when scanning in gym class. A gaze that made children feel vulnerable in the locker room. The school board put him on administrative leave pending the investigation, but everyone was dissatisfied. To some, it was too little, to others, not enough. Bianchi remained sequestered in his tiny rental home on West Broadway, curtains closed, as the whole town watched, whispered, and waited. Weeks became months, then years. By the spring of 1974, the disappearance of Michael and Daniel Carvalho had faded from the headlines and sunk into the cold machinery of unsolved cases. What had once been a furious, round-the-clock manhunt was now a single, dust-covered file in the corner of Sheriff Keller's office, another tragedy in a drawer full of them. He still took it out every few weeks, leafing through witness statements he could recite from memory, gazing at pictures of the bicycles until his eyes stung. But there was nowhere to go. All the leads had withered away. All the theories had imploded. And the hard fact was this: the 1973 world was not constructed to solve such mysteries. No DNA analysis, no security cameras, no computer databases. The bicycles had been fingerprinted footprints, just smears from the boys themselves and perhaps the farmer who discovered them. Tire tracks at the crime scene. They might have come from any one of 1,000 cars cruising Highway 61 daily. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension dispatched their best man, a fastidious investigator named Gerald Hoffman. He spent 3 solid days canvassing the area, crawling on his hands and knees through grass, examining every square inch of earth. And he came up with nothing, no bodies, no witnesses, no trace of physical evidence. They were investigating specters. Bianchi remained the only name in Keller's mind, but proximity to suspicion wasn't proof. Keller had questioned dozens of students, searching for that one piece of testimony that crossed from unsettling to criminal. He found discomfort, fear, unease, but no crime. When Keller finally requested a search warrant for Bianchi's home, Judge Raymond Costa denied it. Suspicion without evidence is persecution, Sheriff, Costa told him. And we don't issue warrants on gossip and anonymous phone calls. That statement would ring in Keller's ears for the remainder of his life. By the autumn of 1974, the school board quietly reinstated Bianchi, though they reassigned him to teach health rather than gym, keeping him away from locker rooms and one-on-one supervision. It was a compromise that pleased no one. Meanwhile, mourning was tearing the Carvalho family apart. Antonio worked himself into 16-hour days at the factory, welding until his hands were blistered, anything to escape the silence waiting for him at home. Maria quit going to Mass altogether. The God she'd prayed to every evening now seemed cruel and uncaring. She sat 4 hours in her son's bedroom, occasionally on Michael's bed, occasionally Daniel's, holding their shirts and inhaling the lingering aroma of Irish spring soap and adolescent sweat, the final vestiges of who they'd been, disappearing day by day. Casseroles were brought by neighbors, untouched. Father Quinn visited every week, bringing prayers that fell on stone like rain. By 1975, the Carvalho boys were legend in Winona, a cautionary ghost story parents used to frighten their children when they asked to be out late. The case file thinned as hope languished. Deputy Lombardi, unable to bear the burden of failure, eventually moved to another county. The world continued on, as it always does. Liquor store robberies, domestic altercations, petty crimes. New tragedies crowded the police blotter. But the vacant space the brothers had occupied remained suspended in time. Then, in November of 1976, Antonio and Maria Carvalho packed what remained of their lives into a borrowed moving van. 3 years of compassionate glances, of pity for every word, of resting in a home that resembled a tomb more than a place to live. They couldn't do it anymore. They went east, to Boston, where Maria's cousin had a job at a textile mill. There, anonymity provided something Winona never could, the ability to walk down a street and not be recognized as the parents of the lost boys. They left no forwarding address, no farewell to Sheriff Keller, no closure. He didn't fault them, at times. The only way to survive loss is to disconnect from everything that reminds you of it, even if it means leaving behind the spot where your children once shared the same air. In 1977, the case was officially darked, archived and forgotten. The file was stored in the basement of the Winona County Courthouse, among hundreds of others, where concrete walls wept with condensation and decades of unsolved stories collected dust. Sheriff Donald Keller retired in 1982, his hair graying, his conscience still troubled by 2 bikes left facing the river, and the question that would haunt him for the rest of his days. When Sheriff Keller retired in 1982, his replacement took over the Carvalho case, along with 50 more that had nowhere else to go. From time to time, another new deputy would draw out the old file, motivated by the same naive hope that perhaps, just perhaps, a new set of eyes might find something that everyone else had overlooked. They'd read the witness accounts, pore over the photographs, to identical-looking boys with black hair and green eyes, caught forever, and after hours of infuriating silence, they'd push the folder back onto its shelf. Some secrets, they came to understand, simply reside beyond the power of answers. And as for Thomas Bianchi, he stayed in Winona, instructing health classes until his retirement in 1988, never married, never had close friends, lived on the outskirts of a town that never really acquitted him in the court of public opinion. Students from subsequent years recalled a man who had been hollowed out, a person who stumbled through his lessons in the absence of passion or vitality, as though something essential had been taken away from him back in 1973, when he spent countless hours being interrogated. When he eventually retired, there was no party, no plaque, not even a principal's handshake. Just a brief mention in the Winona Daily News. Thomas Bianchi, Winona's senior high teacher for many years, retires after serving 15. He moved away quietly, to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, a place where nobody knew his history, where he might live without the burden of whispers trailing behind him down every street. And in the meantime, the Mississippi River continued flowing, slow, steady, forever, bearing silt and secrets in equal proportions. The piece of ground where the Carvalho twins' bikes were discovered became a makeshift memorial for a time. Flowers were left, prayers written out by hand, rosaries, even tiny crosses. But time catches up. Grass overran the spot. Trees sprouted up, stout and strong. The precise location faded, then disappeared completely, as if the earth itself chose to forget. Years went by, then decades. The case became a historical footnote, sometimes popping up in local newspaper columns on Winona's Unsolved Mysteries. But even those references tapered off with the years. To the town's older residents, it was a cautionary tale served over coffee at the Blue Heron Diner. To the rest of the world, it was just another unsolved tale gobbled up by the river. In Boston, however, the tale never ended. Each year on July 14th, Maria Carvalho burned the candles in her apartment window, one for Michael, one for Daniel. She never uttered their names again, not to her cousin, not to co-workers at the textile factory, not even to Antonio. Sorrow had excavated an emptiness within her so huge that words could not span it. Antonio died first, in 1997, officially of a heart attack, though those who knew him said it wasn't his heart that failed, but his will. He had carried his son's absence too long. Maria followed in 2003, still lighting her candles every summer, still waiting for answers that would never come. But then, the river decided to speak. In spring 2019, southern Minnesota was hit by the most severe flooding in 100 years. The Mississippi rose with snowmelt and unrelenting April rain higher than anyone could ever recall. Whole blocks disappeared underwater, living rooms turned into lagoons of suspended furniture and family albums. The toys and porch furniture of children floated gently along with the current. When the river finally peaked, 22 feet above flood stage, it had hit locations unmolested since Winona's establishment in the 1850s, and when the waters receded, they uncovered what time had hidden. On April 27th morning, a county maintenance team showed up at the deserted Riverside Industrial Complex to evaluate flood damage. The site had been vacant for decades, a labyrinth of broken brick warehouses and rusted metal panels, long overtaken by weeds and trespassers. The flood had torn off a section of the perimeter fence and brought down chunks of the foundation. Crew foreman Marcus Johnson, a guy who'd seen his fair share of flood damage, walked into the biggest warehouse, clipboard in hand. The building creaked under the pressure of water damage. Concrete had warped in one corner, creating a jagged hole in the floor. Johnson edged towards it slowly, directing his flashlight into the blackness beneath, hoping to see a crawl space or a dry well. Instead, he stopped. The light beam sliced through muddy darkness and uncovered a secret room, about 8 feet square. Its concrete walls clearly human-made, and inside, bones, human bones. 2 skulls lying side by side, buried half up to their nostrils in silt and trash, as if the humans they had belonged to had been clinging to one another when death arrived. Johnson retreated a step, his heart racing, and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. In 30 minutes, the location was filled with strobing lights. Sheriff Amanda Torres, a little girl when the Carvalho twins disappeared, stood on the rim of the pit, gazing into the past. She recalled the case, the ancient dark file that had terrorized Winona for almost 5 decades. And looking at all those remains, she had a sense deep inside her, this was it. The river had finally let its secret out. The Rochester forensic team came equipped with gear that would have been science fiction in 1973. Ground-penetrating radar, X-ray machines that could be taken into the field, DNA collection kits that could recover genetic material from bone. For 3 meticulous days, they dug the chamber, under the direction of University of Minnesota forensic anthropologist Dr. Sarah Gonzalez. Each bone, each fiber, each piece of clothing that was saved was documented and treated gently. The skeletons were positioned side by side, facing one another, in an area so cramped they would have had to crouch or sit. Both skulls bore unmistakable evidence of blunt force trauma, fractures that were typical of vicious blows. Threads of clothing remained attached to the skeletons, denim, cotton, synthetic material, wonderfully preserved by the oxygen-depleted ground. Among them a few personal effects, a size 9 Converse shoe, belt buckle, and a wristwatch frozen forever at 11:47. Morning or evening, no one could tell. When news of the disaster emerged, Winona was silent. The river had spoken at last, and what it said was more tragic than anyone could have imagined. News travels quickly, but disaster travels quicker. Within a matter of hours of the finding, Minneapolis reporters, Chicago reporters, even national network crews descended upon Winona. The secluded river town that had grieved in quiet for almost a half-century found itself invaded by camera crews, satellite trucks, and microphones. The once forgotten Riverside Industrial Complex now throbbed with the melee of flashing lights and breaking news signage. Standing at the center of it all was Sheriff Amanda Torres, her eyes staring out at a sea of cameras. She read from her prepared statement in a steady voice. The remains found have not yet been officially identified. The investigation continues, but her eyes betrayed her. Every eye watching could see it. The truth she refused to speak. Those bones were Michael and Daniel Carvalho's. After 46 years, Winona's missing twins had finally been discovered. May 2nd, dental records reached the Midwest Medical Examiner's office in Ramsey. Yellowing paper records yanked from a storage bin at a clinic that had been sold 3 times since 1973. Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Patricia Lamont set the X-rays beside new post-mortem charts, prepared using the skulls that had been recovered. She didn't require any explanation. Even before the forensic odontologist identified it, the identification was clear, not fuzzy at all, beyond any dispute. In an hour, it was official. Michael Anthony Carvalho and Daniel Joseph Carvalho, 16 years old, missing since July 14, 1973, were identified. Dr. Lamont sat by herself in her office afterwards, the report shuddering in her hands. Outside, the buzz of a typical workday continued, but within that room, everything halted. Two boys had spent time in that dim concrete room, while the world outside them changed. Their parents growing older, dying in vain, their town moving on. The river had flooded and drained many times. Time had passed, but deep beneath it all, they had waited. And then the forensics arrived, and the horror was real. Each of the twins had endured a fatal skull fracture. Michael's was on his left temple, Daniel's on the back of his right head, wounds typical of strong blows from a blunt instrument. The trends indicated something sinister. Both blows were from behind and slightly higher. It indicated that the boys had been on their knees. All sitting, there were no defense wounds, no fractured forearms or broken fingers. They hadn't even been ready to defend themselves. Within a matter of hours of the finding, Minneapolis reporters, Chicago reporters, even national network crews descended upon Winona. The secluded river town that had grieved in quiet for almost a half-century found itself invaded by camera crews, satellite trucks, and microphones. The once-forgotten riverside industrial complex now throbbed with the melee of flashing lights and breaking news signage. Standing at the center of it all was Sheriff Amanda Torres, her eyes staring out at a sea of cameras. She read from her prepared statement in a steady voice. The remains found have not yet been officially identified. The investigation continues, but her eyes betrayed her. Every eye watching could see it. The truth she refused to speak. Those bones were Michael and Daniel Carvalho's. After 46 years, Winona's missing twins had finally been discovered. May 2nd, dental records reached the Midwest Medical Examiner's office in Ramsey. Yellowing paper records yanked from a storage bin at a clinic that had been sold 3 times since 1973. Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Patricia Lamont set the X-rays beside new post-mortem charts, prepared using the skulls that had been recovered. She didn't require any explanation. Even before the forensic odontologist identified it, the identification was clear, not fuzzy at all, beyond any dispute. In an hour, it was official. Michael Anthony Carvalho and Daniel Joseph Carvalho, 16 years old, missing since July 14, 1973, were identified. Dr. Lamont sat by herself in her office afterwards, the report shuddering in her hands. Outside, the buzz of a typical workday continued, but within that room, everything halted. Two boys had spent time in that dim concrete room, while the world outside them changed. Their parents growing older, dying in vain, their town moving on. The river had flooded and drained many times. Time had passed, but deep beneath it all, they had waited. And then the forensics arrived, and the horror was real. Each of the twins had endured a fatal skull fracture. Michael's was on his left temple, Daniel's on the back of his right head, wounds typical of strong blows from a blunt instrument. The trends indicated something sinister. Both blows were from behind and slightly higher. It indicated that the boys had been on their knees. Or sitting. There were no defense wounds, no fractured forearms or broken fingers. They hadn't even been ready to defend themselves. The autopsy report put it in clinical terms. Positioning of the remains indicates deliberate post-mortem arrangement. But that adjective, deliberate, hung in the air like something evil. Because it wasn't merely meticulous, it was personal. The shreds of their clothing explained the rest of the tale. Forensic textile analyst James Vargas spent days under magnification, studying every thread. Denim from Levi's jeans, cotton from t-shirts, synthetic fibers from 1970s tube socks. Everything matched the original missing persons report. Michael had worn a blue Minnesota Twins t-shirt. Daniel's was red. Both had jeans. Both had Converse sneakers. The same tread pattern noted by investigators back in '73. They had dressed that evening for summer, for a carnival, fireworks, perhaps a slow walk home at the streetlights. Instead, someone had entombed them in a grave of concrete. Not buried by accident, but constructed to guarantee they'd never be discovered. Within 24 hours of notification, Sheriff Torres called together the Dark Case Task Force. A group of experts gathered in an official conference room, turned into an evidence war zone. Its walls plastered with maps of Winona. It appeared in 1973, timelines, and black and white photographs of the twins, smiling back from another time. The group consisted of two-murder detectives from the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, a forensic genealogist with expertise tracing cold case DNA along family histories, and even a historian, who was tasked with untangling 50 years of land records. The initial question was simple: who constructed that hidden room, and when? The concrete walls had to have been built sometime in the 1960s or early 70s, perhaps a fallout shelter, perhaps an secure storage vault. Either one. Someone had known it was there. Someone with keys, access, and opportunity. Records indicated the Riverside Industrial Complex had been owned in 1973 by Riverside Lumber and Distribution, a family business started by Harold Rennert, then later run by his son-in-law, Walter Bianchi. The sheriff froze. That name, Bianchi, sounded like a ringing bell. She went back to the old Carvalho report she'd read years before. There it was, Thomas Bianchi, high school physical education teacher, questioned at length when the twins disappeared, never arrested, reinstated quietly. Sheriff Torres probed further. Walter Bianchi, dead since 2007, had one living brother, Thomas, residing in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and from that point on, the investigation flared anew with surgical precision. Detective Laura Santoro and her colleague James Kuznetsov from the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension went headlong into the records. For 7 consecutive days, they spent their lives within that file, soaking up every photo, every word of Sheriff Keller's 1973 notes. They soon realized that Keller hadn't failed. He'd just been operating blind, in a world without the resources we now take for granted. No DNA, no surveillance, no digital trail, no databases connecting a suspect to a crime. But half a century later, technology could at last see in the dark. The more they learned, the more that single name, Bianchi, began to bring everything into focus. They learned Thomas had been previously married, for a brief time, to Walter's younger sister, Catherine Bianchi. An 18-month marriage that dissolved in divorce in 1970. But even after the divorce, work records indicated Thomas kept working summers at Riverside Lumber, operating inventory, driving delivery trucks, performing odd jobs. He was familiar with that property. He had keys, he had access, and he had a tie that, for the first time in 46 years, made an old suspicion a great deal more sinister. Initially, it was simply another name in the old employee file, but as detectives searched deeper, a pattern started to develop. Few and far between were former employees of Riverside Lumber, but one of them, 81-year-old Frank Gallagher, recalled something that others had not remembered for years. He informed investigators that Walter Bianchi, the owner during the 70s, was strangely protective of his brother-in-law Thomas. Protective in ways that didn't quite add up. He once even expelled a customer from the warehouse for making crass remarks about Thomas's personal life. It was a tiny memory, but it was sufficient to slow down detectives. Because what if that protection had been nothing like that at all? Unraveling the history of the Riverside industrial complex was like excavating layers of sediment, time, ownership shifts, even a 1988 fire that burned through vital records. Most of the individuals who had worked there were deceased now, or their recollections had worn away into fuzzy pieces. But modern science didn't need memories. Forensic genealogist Dr. Emily Navarro extracted DNA from the marrow of the twins' bones, not to confirm who they were, but to find who else had been with them. Then, in a process that would have been unthinkable in 1973, she used luminol and alternate light sources to search the underground chamber. Under that eerie blue glow, new evidence came alive. Sheer droplets of blood had bled into the concrete years ago, and remained there, hidden in the pores of time. The low oxygen air had preserved it, like antique writing awaiting decipherment. In the meantime, Detective James Kuznetsov was dispatched to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to locate the man whose name had re-emerged like a specter from the past, Thomas Bianchi. He discovered him alone, an 88-year-old recluse in a worn-out ranch house where the grass grew to ankle depth, and yellowed newspapers littered the porch. Each morning, Bianchi dragged himself to his mailbox. Each afternoon, he sat on his porch, observing children from the neighborhood play in the street. To everyone else, he could have been just another solitary old man. But to Kuznetsov, the picture was disturbing. That rigid gaze, that immobility, was it desire, shame, or only the vacant eyes of a man who had waited all his life for something to catch up with him? Neighbor said he sometimes forgot where he was, wandering outside in his bathrobe. Age had taken much from him, but memory, it seemed, had refused to let go. Then came the DNA results, and they changed everything. Traces of biological material found inside the concrete vault, epithelial cells embedded in the wall, matched Thomas Bianchi's DNA, with a probability greater than 99.9%. The blood on the walls was that of the twins, but the skin cells were those of their killer. It was conclusive. Sheriff Amanda Torres summoned a crisis meeting with County Attorney Patricia Volkov, a cold case specialist renowned for converting impossibilities into convictions. They went through the evidence, the DNA match, the historical connection to the crime scene, the behavior patterns, the old witness statements. Yes, it was circumstantial, but the circumstances formed a chain so tight it left no room for innocence. On May 22, 2019, after nearly half a century, Sheriff Torres signed the arrest warrant for Thomas Bianchi. At dawn the following morning, the task force arrived at his home in Cedar Rapids. The sun had just come up, a soft honey-colored light spilling over the still street as 4 unmarked cars came to a halt. When Thomas Bianchi opened the door, he didn't seem surprised. He stood before them in threadbare pajamas and a frayed cardigan, the prominent creases of age etched across his face. His eyes darted between the badges to the officers on his lawn, and to the heavens, as if accepting the moment he'd feared had finally dawned. He didn't ask what they were there for, he didn't demand a lawyer. He simply breathed and spoke softly. "It's about the Carvalho boys, isn't it?" Then he moved aside, beckoning them into a living room filled with the smell of tobacco and dust, a time capsule of isolation. The furniture was covered in blankets, the walls covered in framed pictures from a life spent in secrecy. The confession took 7 hours. Bianchi waived his right to counsel, muttering with a cold laugh, "At 88, what's left to protect? My life's already over." Initially, His voice was monotone, robotic. Later, it shook as he recounted the night of July 14, 1973, a narrative he had plainly told himself over and over 4 decades. He told police he was driving home from his brother-in-law's warehouse that night. That's why he left Pearl City, why he fled to Denver. But no matter how far you flee, you can't outrun what resides within you. When the truth eventually emerged, it emerged quickly and loudly. The arrests were all within 48 hours, in the final days of April 2024. Connor Walsh was arrested at his Denver restaurant during dinner rush, handcuffed and escorted away. A shocked employee stood silently by. Tyler Boyle was arrested at his parents' home in Pearl City, his mother shrieking that her son was a good boy who'd done a terrible thing. And Melissa Torres was arrested on the job, led from her dental office, in front of shocked patients, her engagement ring glinting in fluorescent light, one last time, before she vanished from view inside the rear of a police cruiser. The indictment was serious. Connor was indicted on a charge of involuntary manslaughter, for starting the fight that resulted in Ethan's death. Tyler was charged with being an accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice, and Melissa was charged as an accessory to conceal the offense. The 3 were also indicted on other counts for tampering with evidence and disposal of human remains. As the facts became known, the media dissected the story. The headlines blared about the pact of silence, about the 6-year lies, about the 3 friends who'd stood at Ethan's memorial, who'd embraced his mourning mother, all the while knowing what they'd done. In the courtroom, Patricia McLeod attended each hearing, motionless. She did not cry, she did not speak, she simply gazed straight ahead, as if her face had turned to rock. Victim advocates sat with her, speaking words she would not listen to. She had held on to hope for 6 years, thinking her son could be alive out there somewhere, that he would one day return home. But now she knew, Ethan hadn't escaped. He hadn't disappeared into another existence. He died on that night, in the rain and the mud, within 2 miles of home, while she lay sleeping, blissfully ignorant. He'd been tossed into a river, like an animal, by people he loved, by people he trusted. And Pearl City would never be the same again.